Hi, this is Brass Check, and I'm recording this on Friday, February 17th, 2023. And this is something I've been thinking about for months, maybe even a year or more, and I'm only finally just getting to it. Everybody knows the Muppets, and most people know that the creator of the Muppets was Jim Henson. How many people know that Jim Henson died prematurely? He died at 53. Which I think even in a economically undeveloped part of the world would be kind of a young age to die at. So what did he die of? And when did he die? Well, Jim Henson died, let's see, what date? May 16th, 1990. Jim Henson died May 16th, 1990. And a few days later, in the Associated Press, they had an article explaining what he died of. I'm just going to read it. This is Associated Press. This is the official news of the official government. Muppets creator Jim Henson died of severe pneumonia caused by a rare complication from common bacteria, but not as rare as it used to be. The pneumonia began with an infection with group A Streptococcus bacteria, which cause a wide variety of infections, but are mostly mild infections such as sore throat and impetigo, said Centers for Disease Control spokesman Chuck Fallis. That's his name. CDC researchers cautioned in January that a group of A. Streptococcus infections, quote, have reemerged as a public health problem, end of quote. But the Atlanta-based agency said, quote, factors contributing to the apparent recent increase are unclear. And then it goes on. 19 cases were confirmed and here's a clue, in one hospital in the first 8 months of 1989, when there had been only 3 reported in all of 1987. Those serious bloodstream infections occur in just 4 out of 5 cases per 100,000 Americans each year. It is still uncommon. Of those with severe infections, only 1 in 5 patients goes on to develop severe pneumonia, as Jim Henson did. He had complained of cold symptoms to a physician cousin the week before his death. He did not see a doctor for treatment until he checked into an unnamed, and they don't name it, New York hospital Tuesday morning after he began having trouble breathing. By that point, doctors said the bacterial infection from his lungs had begun attacking other organs, and the illness could no longer be controlled with antibiotics. Okay, now, does that mean it couldn't be controlled with antibiotics, or they used the wrong antibiotics? The fatality rate associated with group A Streptococcus bacteremia is between 20 and 30%. Serious group A streptococcal infections, quote, generally occur in the elderly or people with decreased immunity because of an underlying illness such as cancer, Fallis said. Before the rise of in serious group A streptococcal infections, they had been less common than in previous generations. Over the past 5 decades, the rate and severity had been decreasing, end of quote, Fallis said. Infections are usually easily treated if caught in time. The bacteria are quite sensitive to penicillin. So let's unwrap this a little bit, because this is a very important story, even though it occurred in 1990. First of all, Jim Henson was not an obscure guy. He's still not an obscure guy. So a 53-year-old man going into a hospital with a lung problem and coming out dead is kind of a big deal. Notice the hospital that was responsible doesn't have its name mentioned. Guarantee, folks, no exaggeration, somebody from that hospital contacted the demons at AP and made sure that information was taken out. That's number one. Number two, notice that the people that die of this their outbreaks are in hospitals. Now, they called it an outbreak. Now, was the outbreak, and they're very vague here because they're experts at being vague, did the person catch the streptococcal illness in the hospital, or did they come to the hospital with it? There's no way of knowing from reading this article. Okay? What do we know about hospitals? Number one, they have gone into severe decline as so-called healthcare becomes the number one and soon to be only industry in the United States. So they want to squeeze every possible penny out of their operations. And that has resulted in poor hygiene, poor maintenance practices, and just a general, pardon the French, shit show in American hospitals. So it is not strange that we would see more hospital-induced infections. In fact, that is, you really want to get out of the hospital as soon as you can, not just because the greedy bastards want to put another person in in your bed, but because they are so poorly maintained and bacteria of all kinds are so rampant in hospitals that the sooner you get out, the safer you're going to be. That's a known fact. Anyway, so there's been an increase in this. We're not sure whether these things are being caught in hospitals, and the hospital responsible for his death, because I do believe there was a lawsuit. Let me check. I can't find anything about this, but this was put under the category of toxic shock syndrome, which was a big deal, I remember, in the 80s. And it would be basically somebody would get an infection, it would rage out of control, and their body would go into shock, and they would die. Other narratives are related to Henson in particular, as he had the flu, and the flu made him weak to the point that he got a rare complication from a common bacteria. But again, we don't know whether he picked up that bacteria in the hospital or if he went there with it. And those are all interesting questions, but the real interesting question, and here we go. In 2019, a random, no one's really a random person, but a non-celebrity person, a man in his 50s, a heavy smoker in poor health, went into a Chinese hospital and died of the equivalent of severe pneumonia. And by the way, I talked about this on day one. If you go to any medical texts, and you can find them online, and read about what it's like to die from pneumonia, it's horrifying. Okay? And those symptoms were presented to the public as the symptoms of COVID. And if you were an uninformed person, you would be horrified. It sounds like the world's most horrifying disease. Well, pneumonia is a horrifying disease. And guess how many people die from it every year? Well, about 1 million people go to a hospital for care with pneumonia, and 50,000 of them, that's 5%, die. So in the United States alone, that's 50,000%. In the world, 2.5 million people die from pneumonia every year. So it is not an uncommon disease. And here we have a very famous, very wealthy, he had just sold his company to Disney for $200 million, went into a New York City hospital and came out dead. Now, here's my question. In 2019, an obscure and unknown guy, not a famous person, who was a heavy smoker, who already had ill health, went into a Chinese hospital, died with pneumonia-like symptoms, and he also came out dead. In Jim Henson's case, it was called a rare outcome. and it was said to involve bacteria, which makes sense if you're extremely weakened by an illness or general ill health, or a combination of the two, or being exposed to a filthy New York City hospital. There's a good chance that bacteria will take over, and you will have what's called the toxic shock syndrome, which phrase not used very often anymore. Though if you go back and read all the scare headlines and stories about COVID, they were always talking about, the organs shutting down. This has never been seen before in the history of medicine. Bullshit on that. It's the most common way people die when they have pneumonia. In Henson's case, the infection traveled to other organs. Not unusual at all in somebody who is suffering a fatal case of this. So here's my question. When Jim Henson, creator of the beloved Muppets, died at 53 in a New York hospital, did the world's scientific community, starting with the Chinese, or starting with the New Yorkers, because it happened in New York, did they sit up on the edge of their chairs and say, we must stop the world right now and start a multinational task force to investigate how this obscure, heavy smoking, in poor health Chinese man died? Because we've never seen these kind of symptoms before. In other words, they're claiming they never saw anybody die of pneumonia and the bacterial infections connected with pneumonia and the organ shutdowns that take place in a case of fatal pneumonia. That was their claim. So, okay, we gotta get the CDC in on this. We got to get all the great researchers all over the world to burn the midnight oil to find out what is the new and never before seen virus that is causing these rare, never before seen deaths. That's why. See how illogical that is? See how improbable that is? That's why I called bullshit on this very, 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 very early in the game. My earliest tweet was February 1st, 2020, and I pointed out Wuhan's an unhealthy place. And if a guy goes into the hospital with other health problems and a heavy smoker, and he dies of something related to his lungs, there's nothing unusual about that at all. However, it became unusual, didn't it? Let's look at a few little details here. People may not remember this, but in October 18th, 2019 to be precise, just 2 months before the dangerous, deadly global pandemic, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation hosted something called Event 201. And it was a high-level pandemic exercise based on the idea of a novel coronavirus, capturing the world and forcing large-scale economic and societal consequences. Okay, so October 18th, 2019, Bill and Melinda Gates host this thing in New York City called Event 201. Not a conspiracy theory. If you go to the Center for Health Security.org and search it, that's a John Hopkins project, you'll find it. And they called, by the way, the fake disease, the imaginary disease that they were doing a pandemic exercise, they called it nCoV. nCoV, C-O-V, just for your fun. Who else was invited to attend this meeting where they ran through the scenario of how they would change the world if we had an outbreak of a pneumonia-like lung disease, which we've already established, I think, that these things are induced in hospitals by poor sanitation. Who else was invited? Well, Johns Hopkins, of course. They were the ones that created the dashboard. Remember the dashboards? 10,000 people have died of COVID this week. Well, not really this week, since the beginning of the outbreak. Yeah, but they would put the total number on the board every night. on every newscast, day in and day out. Somebody really should do some archaeology and go by and find those old newscasts and get screenshots and do a documentation of the terror program these people operated against humanity. But that's another project for another day. Who else was invited to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation event? Well, the World Economic Forum had to be there. Yeah, they were there, working on the high-level pandemic exercise. Who else was there? Well, the CDC was there. Yes, they were. Who else was there? NBC News was there. And if you're a longtime Brass Check viewer and listener, you know that we have tracked NBC News long before COVID came along. They are the most unreliable, despicably dishonest reporters of medical and public health information maybe in history. They're not just a little bad, they're horrendously bad. So they were at the table. They were one of the stakeholders. Who else was there? The Chinese version of the CDC. Okay, so we had the Chinese version of the CDC, the World Economic Forum, the most corrupt news outlet New York Times may be more, but they're right in the same ballpark. NBC, John Hopkins, of course, the inventors of the dashboard, the death dashboard. They were all together 2 months before the emergence of a never-before-seen coronavirus. And how did they know that virus even existed? Because a totally obscure guy who was a heavy smoker, who was living in the most polluted city in the world, who was already in ill health, died of pneumonia, and it didn't look pretty. And that was enough for the whole scientific, or the whole infectious disease scientific world, starting with the CDC and the WHO, the World Health Organization, to stop everything and start a high-level, multinational research task force to discover the virus. And by God, they discovered the virus, and they discovered it in record time, didn't they? And if you look at the so-called science that they used to discover that virus, how about garbage? We've heard the term false news. I think we need another term, false science. And even with this thing barely having an effect on anybody, unless you want to call every death a COVID death, which is what was done, they managed to declare this a pandemic. And once they declared it a pandemic, all the nations of the world had agreed previously that next time there's a pandemic, we're all going to join in joint coordinated activity. And by God, they did, didn't they? So I want to take this full circle so this is absolutely clear. In 1990, a Senti multimillionaire, he was worth $200 million plus, walked into a New York hospital, 53-year-old man with no particular health problems that we know of, and came out in a body bag. And it was attributed to a rare bacterial infection exacerbated by a flu. And the cause of death and the phenomenon observed were pneumonia. Pneumonia is a very horrifying kind of disease. And when he died, the world did not stop. They did not call the CDC to go into hyperactive mode, to get 100 scientists working around the clock to find the rare, never before seen virus. It was said that Jim Henson died in a rare way. But even that was not enough to start a panicked search for a brand new novel coronavirus. And then, literally, 30 years later, is it 30? Let me do my math. Yeah, 30 years later, when an obscure guy dies in China of something that looks a whole lot similar, that becomes the clue of the new, never-before-seen, newly emergent, deadly virus that has high infection rate and will soon sweep the nation or the world. Do you see the bullshit here? That's where it started, and frankly, that's where it needed to end. And it didn't. Once the first lie was accepted, then everything else fell into place. And, we made a film, which we released in August 2020, called Fauci's First Fraud, HIV equals AIDS equals death. They followed, and Fauci was around for that. In fact, he was one of the cheerleaders for that. They used the same playbook back then, and that's coming on 40 years ago. They had some people who died, and they died in unpleasant ways, which is unfortunately the way some people do die. They're dying from a disease and not in their sleep. These were mostly men in their mid to late 30s who had, in the first generation, who had long histories of substance abuse, erratic lifestyle, abuse of pharmacological drugs, including antibiotics, but heavy abuse of a drug called poppers. It's all in the film. You got to watch it. And yeah, those guys wrecked their immune systems and died miserable deaths. And the CDC, in conjunction with NIH, went out of their way to discount, it's in the film, any lifestyle connection between those deaths, any lifestyle connection leading to those deaths. They absolutely wrote it off and would not even look at it. Instead, what did they do? They went in search of the magic virus. And by God, they found it, and then they found a way to test for the magic virus that turned out to be absolute scientific bullshit, and they scared millions and millions of people into thinking they had the deadly virus that was absolutely going to kill them. They then used that terror to sell a drug called AZT, which had previously been banned for human use because it was so deadly. They gave it to millions of people, and they, according to one statistician, a Harvard-trained man who also happened to be a gay activist, they killed over 300,000 gay men alone. That doesn't count all the people they killed in Africa or all the African-American people they killed, because they, for some reason, African-American people in poor neighborhoods seem to catch the virus a lot. So they needed a lot of AZT. And if a pregnant mother was tested positive for the virus and had no symptoms whatsoever, she was required to take AZT. And when her child was born, even without testing, the infants were given AZT, and they were killed. Now, AZT is no longer given in the same doses it used to be. They figured out, well, if you kill these people, how much money can we make off them? So now they give it in a diluted form, in a cocktail. Their famous cocktail. So anyway, they've played this game before on us before, and they did it again. And anybody else talking about this in this way? No. So if you're a supporter of Brass Check, thank you very much. It takes time, money, and effort to do these things, do this research, do this thinking. And I hope this has given you some insight. But remember, a multi-millionaire died of something exactly, well, not exactly, because everything's different, but died of something very similar, a rare pneumonia. And his death was no big deal, but the death of an obscure guy known to be in ill health, known to be a heavy smoker, that was enough to set off a scientific firestorm in search of a virus. And once that virus was found and claimed to be the source of the disease and not a byproduct of it, that was enough justification to shut down the world economically, plunge hundreds of millions of people into extreme poverty, destroy countless thousands of family-owned small businesses, disrupt the educations of hundreds of millions, well, billions maybe, of children around the world, drive a disproportionate number of people to deaths from despair. That would be suicide, that would be drug overdose, that would be alcohol, death by alcohol. And who knows what other deaths that weren't even recorded. And then that was enough to coerce people into receiving an experimental injection. I won't even call it gene therapy anymore. And I call it an experimental injection because you still cannot get the list of ingredients that are in those injections. You don't even know. Your idiot doctor who pushed this on you certainly doesn't know. And your employer who pushed this on you, some large employers did, doesn't know. So this whole story was enough to compel, to coerce, and pressure, using deceit, hundreds of millions of people into receiving an experimental injection. And now what are we finding about that experimental injection? It has caused more injuries, serious injuries and death to human beings than all the vaccines administered combined since the beginning of the U.S. federal government's VAERS report, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. And it's, by the way, there's no question of who's being killed and injured by the vaccine, and here's how you know. They're trying to say that COVID, post-vaccine, that COVID killed people. You know, they got the vaccine, but of course the vaccine didn't really keep you from getting COVID, so some people got COVID, and then they died of COVID. No, we now have the science to know 100% beyond the shadow of any doubt what those people are dying of. Here's why. The people that die of the vaccine have only the spike proteins in their brain and heart. The people who supposedly die of COVID have other biological artifacts in their body related to the disease that they're calling COVID. Okay? You could say that COVID killed those people, but when you do autopsies and tests on dead people who've received the vaccine, and all they have as an artifact in their body is spike protein and none of the other normal biochemical processes that you would see with the disease that they call COVID, then you know they were injured or killed by the vaccine. So there's no question anymore about what this vaccine has done to people. And here we are on February 17th, 2023, and the FDA has approved the addition of the COVID vaccine for the childhood vaccination schedule with the applause of Bill Gates and the World Health Organization and the CDC and NIH and Tony Fauci and NBC and I'm sure the World Health, the World Economic Forum, and I'm sure Johns Hopkins. This whole thing, in addition to all the other evils it was a vaccine marketing exercise, which is what I said February 1st, 2020. Anyway, I guess I had to get this rant out. Have a great weekend, assuming you're hearing this on a Friday, but maybe you're hearing it at another time. Brass Check TV, free to you, not free to us. We've got a server bill, we've got an email software bill, we've got a tech helper bill, and that happens every month. So to everybody that is supporting us financially, that's paying for their subscription in one way or another, we really appreciate it. If you're not, consider doing so. Everybody's got money for the newspaper and the cable bill and all that. Do you have money for media that's actually serving you? That's really the issue here. And when you help us, it allows us to get this information out to the world. So thanks to all our supporters, and if you're not a supporter already, please consider becoming one.